Just about 8 months ago I decided to buy a new chain set, and because I'm a bit of a cheapskate I decided to look on AliExpress. I wanted 175mm length cranks. It had to have double chain wheels with a maximum of 50 and 34 teeth, and preferably with a GXP type connector between the chain rings and the crank. I came up with this chain set. It cost me a total of £68, including taxes and postage. After I ordered it, about a month later I received this package in the post. All of the chain set components were in that box. In addition, they were inside these bubble wrap bags. The box was rather basic. I didn't care. It protected the parts inside. So let's take a look at those parts. On the top was the chain ring unit, which was machined out of a single billet. This had 50 and 34 teeth, and it says it's machined out of 7075 aluminium alloy. The machining was quite tidy, the corners were chamfered, and there were no burrs left on. The unit looked as though it had been anodized. For the price, the finish was reasonable. The cranks are made out of aluminium alloy, although it doesn't say what type. They're of a fairly basic design. The back of the cranks have pockets in them in order to save weight. This is an open section design, which is not as stiff in torsion as a closed or hollow section design. More about that later. The right hand crank has a 24mm Shimano style steel axle fitted into it. It came with 3 torque screws in order to attach the chain rings to the crank. There's also a screw-in end cap and an adjuster in order to take the slack out of the system. In this gap here was a BSA style bottom bracket. I haven't shown this here because it's already fitted to my touring bike. Needless to say, I didn't use it with this chain set. The cranks look as though they have some sort of paint or plastic coating on them. With one huge exception, the quality of the part seems commensurate with the price I paid. Let's have a look at how this fits together. The chain rings slip over the crank arm like this. It's held in place by 3 screws. As you can see here, the fit of the rings onto the crank arm are a little bit loose, but not excessively so. The 3 screws hold it in place. There was no torque setting for these screws, so I'm just doing them up by feel. The spline fitting for the left-hand crank fits very nicely. Also, my pedals screwed into the pedal threads perfectly. I had previously removed the Ultegra crankset. There's a video about that in the top right, and I'm reusing the bottom bracket bearing supplied with the bike. I measured the crankset axle diameter and this was perfect. So not surprisingly, the axle slipped easily into the bottom bracket. I then pushed the left hand crank onto the axle splines. Next I screwed up the end cap and tightened it up to remove any lateral movement. The next job was to tighten the bolts on the left hand crank. The cranks came with no instructions, so there was no torque setting supplied. I decided to use the value that's normally used for Shimano cranks, 14 Newton meters. I started tightening the bolts, and at about 10 Newton meters I felt something give. On inspection, the threads in the crank arm had stripped, so I was unable to tighten the bolts up. The thread stripping is the major quality flaw that I referred to earlier. For most people this would mean that the cranks are useless, scrap. However, as I'm an engineer, I decided to engineer a solution. As I lacked workshop facilities, I had to improvise. Before making a repair, I wanted to find out what had caused the problem. I mentioned that the threads in the clamp had stripped, so the bolts wouldn't tighten the crank around the axle splines. I couldn't assess the threads in the crank because they had stripped. I measured the diameter of the bolts that were supplied and found that they were about 0.3 of a millimeter under size. That might not sound very much, but it is about 25% of the total thread depth. Also, I thought the bolts could have or should have been a bit longer in order to engage more threads. The stripping of the crank threads seemed to be a combination of poor manufacturing control and poor specification of those bolts.
Perhaps the best repair approach would have been to install helicoil inserts. However, I didn't have a helicoil kit, so I used an alternative approach. I made a couple of small steel tubes, one for each bolt, with M6 threads inside. I then blind drilled out the stripped thread so that the tubes would fit in the hole. And this is what the result looks like. Not the prettiest repair, however I've used it for the last 3,000 kilometers without incident. I know weight is important to some, so here are some statistics. The Ultegra chainset that I took off the bike comes in at 685 gram. I also weighed a Shimano GRX 600 double, and that was 830 gram. The RaceWork chainset that we're looking at here comes in at 790 gram. As it falls between the weight of the other two chainsets, I'm going to call this RaceWork one light-ish. However, in the round, compared to the weight of me and the bike of over 100 kilos, I think 100 grams is neither here nor there. Once I'd fitted the crankset to the bike, I checked the alignment of the chain rings. And if you look at the run out on that large chain ring, you'll see that it's almost nothing. When I was riding it, I detected no issue with the pedal thread alignment. The gear changing from the large to the small chainring and from the small to the large chainring was flawless. I haven't experienced any mischanges even under load. The ramps and pins on the chainrings really do work. In terms of the speed and quality of the gear changes, they're not quite as fast or quite as smooth as my Ultegra chainset, but it's not far behind. I think all but the most discerning would be very happy. The outer width of the cranks across the pedal threads is known as the Q factor. The Q on these is at 142 millimeters. Here, the context of the rider is important. I'm a fairly chunky 90 kilos, but with a fairly modest 800 watt maximum power output. My first test is, does the chain rub on the front gear changer when I'm climbing the hills or high power outputs? The answer is no to both cases. The second test is around the feel through the cranks, otherwise described as a subjective stiffness test. The bottom line is, the cranks, despite having that open section, don't feel any less or more stiff than any other crank I've used. I've used the RaceWork chainset for over 3,000 kilometers during a British winter. All of the images of the chainset you've seen so far have been after they've been subjected to that use. Apart from the thread stripping when I first installed the cranks, I've had no other minor or major problem with the chainset. It's also been creak-free. There are no obvious signs of corrosion or the finish deteriorating on either the cranks or the chain wheels. The chainset has just worked. Looking at the large chain wheel, we can see how much wear has taken place. The chain was on the large chain wheel for probably 95% of its use. As you can see here, there's almost no wear on the small chain ring. After 3,000 kilometers, I can see some wear on that chain ring, and I'm going to estimate it will need replacing after about 6,000 to 8,000 kilometers. The good news is these chain wheels can be obtained fairly cheaply on AliExpress for about £30. The only other issue that I identified was a small amount of rust corrosion on the inside of the bottom bracket spindle. The good news is, although the finish wasn't top-notch to start with, it hasn't really deteriorated.
Right then, it's time to summarise. What do I think about these RaceWork cranks? Well, first of all, I'm going to set aside the issue of the thread stripping. I'll come back to that later. Now, I think it's important to consider this crankset in relation to what it cost. What did I get for my £68? I got a set of lightish cranks that fitted together and onto the bike very well. They performed almost as well as the Shimano equivalent, and they seemed fairly durable. What's not to like? What's not to like is a set of cranks where the threads strip. Now for me, I didn't see that as a problem, I saw it as a challenge. So I set about making a repair, which I successfully carried out, and the repair has been working fine for thousands of kilometers. However, I take the point that for the vast majority of buyers that would not be acceptable. If it weren't for those thread stripping, I would probably recommend these cranks, but because they did, I cannot recommend them. Not unless you're willing to take on the challenge of the repair. From me, for now, it's goodbye.